What if the story of who you are wasn't written in books, but in your blood? For generations, being Mexican has been described as something simple, a mixture, a proud blend of worlds. Spanish courage, indigenous roots, and maybe a whisper of Africa. A single united identity called Mestizo. The science has begun to whisper a different story. One buried under centuries of silence and written in the double helix of every cell. It started quietly, in labs far from the noise of politics or pride. In 2014, a research team from Stanford and the National Autonomous University of Mexico decided to map what they called the true genetic geography of Mexico. They expected a smooth gradient, a country blended over centuries into a shared heritage. What they found instead was a map of fractures. From the mountains of Sonora to the jungles of Chiapas, DNA told a tale of separation so deep it stunned even the scientists. The Seri of the north and the Maya of the south, two peoples living under the same flag, turned out to be as genetically distinct as Europeans are from East Asians. It wasn't just one Mexico, it was many Mexicos, hidden in plain sight. And that was only the beginning. By 2023, with the Mexico City Prospective Study, scientists analyzed the genomes of over 140,000 people. They tried to measure the average Mexican, but averages are liars. The results showed ancestry percentages stretching from barely 10% indigenous to nearly 90%. In one country, one street, one family, DNA could tell entirely different histories, because beneath one surname might lie the bloodline of Aztec emperors, beneath another, the genes of African slaves trafficked through Veracruz, and beneath another, the faint echo of Asian sailors who crossed the Pacific centuries before anyone thought to write their names down. For decades, history said that Mexico's identity was unity, but the genome said something far stranger. It said that Mexico wasn't a melting pot, it was a mirror, shattered into 1,000 reflections. Each fragment held a truth, and together they revealed the story of a nation built not on sameness, but on survival.
Long before flags, languages, or maps, Mexico's DNA was already writing stories. Stories older than pyramids, older than names. Archaeologists call them remains. Geneticists call them samples. But in truth, they're echoes. Whispers of people who walked this land thousands of years before anyone imagined the word Mexico. In the early 2000s, deep beneath the volcanic soil of central Mexico, a group of archaeologists uncovered a cluster of graves near the ruins of an ancient city called Zacatenco, a forgotten pre-Aztec settlement north of what is now Mexico City. The bones were fragile, the teeth worn, the skulls delicate and ancient. But inside those bones, hidden in the labyrinths of cells, scientists found something extraordinary. Mitochondrial DNA, the strand passed unbroken from mother to daughter across generations. When they analyzed it, the code spoke of time. The women buried there carried haplogroup A2, one of the oldest genetic lineages in the Americas, a line that began more than 10,000 years ago in Siberia. These were descendants of the first people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the continent, who survived ice, famine, and extinction, and whose daughters still walk modern Mexico's streets. One woman's DNA matched the same markers found in families living today in Puebla, Tlaxcala, and Yucatan, a direct maternal chain stretching unbroken across 2,300 years. Empires fell, languages died, religions changed. Her lineage did not. But what happened next would complicate everything, because by the time the Mexica, the Aztecs, rose to power, cities like Zacatenco had already vanished. Conquest wasn't born with European sails. It began right here. The Aztecs conquered, resettled, and replaced populations long before the Spanish set foot on Veracruz shores. Archaeologists could see it in the bones. Skull shape shifted, burial customs changed, and the old maternal lines seemed to vanish. But DNA told another truth. Those ancient lineages hadn't disappeared. They had moved. Hidden in mountain villages, preserved in quiet valleys, they endured, surviving the rise and fall of gods and empires alike. When geneticists ran broader tests in the 21st century, they found something breathtaking. Those same haplogroups, A2, B2, and C1, weren't isolated. They were everywhere. From the deserts of Sonora to the highlands of Chiapas, from the coasts of Nayarit to the valleys of Oaxaca. The same maternal fingerprints appeared again and again, like a melody repeating across time. The story buried in those ancient graves wasn't of extinction, it was of resistance. The women of ancient Mexico didn't vanish when the cities burned or when empires rose. Their blood simply went quiet, waiting for science to listen.
When the ships arrived in 1519, they didn't just bring soldiers, they brought a genetic revolution. The story we're told about the Spanish conquest is one of armies, battles, and cities burned to the ground. But what happened afterward was far quieter and far more permanent. It wasn't written in ink or carved into stone. It was written in the code of life itself. When Hernán Cortés and his 500 men marched inland from Veracruz, they carried ambition, faith, and steel. But no wives, no sisters, no daughters. They came as men, and they would build a new population from the women they conquered. Within 2 years, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was ash and rubble. But within a generation, a new people had emerged, not by treaty, but by biology. Modern genetic research shows this clearly. When scientists analyzed the Y chromosomes, the paternal DNA, of thousands of Mexican men, they found something undeniable. Nearly 2/3 of paternal lines are European, primarily Iberian. But when they looked at the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal side, the story flipped. Almost 90% of it was indigenous. Two halves of one person, each carrying a different side of history. This imbalance isn't just data, it's a record of power, of women taken, families reshaped, and generations born from violence disguised as kinship. The Spanish didn't just conquer land, they rewrote ancestry. Yet the conquest didn't end with Cortés. In the centuries that followed, more Iberian waves arrived. Canary Islanders in the 1700s sent to settle Yucatan and Texas. Refugees from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, artists and intellectuals seeking safety in Veracruz and Guadalajara. Each wave added another layer to the genome, another echo of Europe embedded in Mexico's chromosomes. It wasn't one invasion, it was many. But while Europe wrote its mark in the Y chromosome, another story was happening beneath the surface, in ports, in plantations, in silence. Because the Spanish ships that sailed west from Seville didn't always carry explorers. Some carried chains. Between 1521 and 1810, over 200,000 Africans were trafficked into New Spain, an unspoken history that would leave a deep genetic shadow. In Veracruz and the coastal towns of Guerrero, scientists later found populations carrying up to 40% African ancestry. 40, not 2 or 3. Entire communities whose heritage was erased from history books, but preserved in blood. In the 2020 census, less than 2% of Mexicans identified as Afro-descendants.
but the DNA said otherwise. This wasn't erasure by chance, it was by design. Colonial records reclassified Afro-descendants as Mestizo, blending them into a new label meant to hide difference. Mulatto, Zambo, Castizo. Labels stacked like walls until identity became math, until the past disappeared behind color and class. And yet, in the code of the genome, those voices never went silent. They hummed in mitochondrial markers and skin tones, in the rhythm of music, in the curves of a face that no document could deny. Because while history tried to forget, DNA remembered.
Every history book talks about ships coming from Spain, but few ever mention the ships that came from the other side of the world. Between 1565 and 1815, a single maritime artery connected two colonies that technically belonged to one empire, the Philippines and New Spain. It was called the Manila Galleon Trade. Once a year, a ship left Manila carrying silk, spices, ivory, and people. Sailors, servants, soldiers, and slaves, men and women from the islands of Southeast Asia, Filipino, Malay, Indonesian, Chinese. When they arrived in Acapulco, most vanished into the vastness of Mexico. No one wrote their stories. No one recorded their names. They became ghosts. But their DNA didn't forget. In 2022, geneticist Juan Rodriguez published a paper that stunned the academic world. He found unmistakable traces of Southeast Asian ancestry in coastal Guerrero, genetic signatures dating back nearly 4 centuries. They weren't European. They weren't African. They were markers found in the Philippines, in Borneo, in the islands of the South China Sea. And the most surprising part? The ancestry was strongest in mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, meaning these weren't just sailors or soldiers, they were women. Women who became part of Mexican society, sometimes through servitude, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through force. Their names may have been erased, but their children carried their legacy in every cell. In small towns along Guerrero's coast, locals had long noticed faint echoes of another world. Certain dishes cooked with coconut milk, lullabies with melodies no one could trace, words that didn't sound like Spanish or Nahuatl. For centuries, people thought it was coincidence. Then the genome proved it wasn't. These weren't isolated cases. They were fingerprints of forgotten crossings. When the Spanish built their empire, they didn't just conquer land, they connected oceans. The Manila Galleon didn't just trade goods, it traded genes. Across 4 centuries, thousands of Asian migrants settled, worked, and disappeared into the mosaic of Mexico. Some became artisans in Puebla. Some labored in Acapulco's docks. Some fled the Philippines' forced conversions and found new lives, baptized again, renamed, absorbed. By the time their descendants were born, no one remembered where they came from. But their genomes did. Today, when Mexican families test their DNA, some find fragments of haplogroup M, a lineage found mostly in East and Southeast Asia. They see genetic matches in Manila, Jakarta, and Cebu, across seas they never knew their ancestors crossed. It's a reminder that history didn't just travel west with Columbus. Sometimes it came east, quietly, invisibly, through trade winds and bloodlines. And just like that, the myth of a 2-continent ancestry, European and Indigenous, broke apart again. Because beneath the skin of modern Mexico, there was another current flowing, a Pacific whisper, a ghostly bridge between islands and continents, still alive in chromosomes.
On the surface, Mexico looks united. One language, one flag, one proud identity. But inside its genome, it's a country divided by mountains, deserts, and time itself. When geneticists from Stanford and the National Institute of Genomic Medicine mapped DNA samples from across Mexico, they expected to see a gentle gradient, a smooth blend from north to south. Instead, they found something astonishing, a patchwork of genetic nations living side by side. In the northern deserts of Sonora, the average person carries over 60% European ancestry, pale skin, green eyes, and last names that trace back to Andalusian towns. Travel 1,500 kilometers south to Guerrero, and the picture flips completely. There, DNA shows over 95% indigenous ancestry, with haplogroups stretching back to the earliest American settlers, as if Spain never arrived. Two people from the same country, separated by a day's drive, yet as genetically distant as Northern Europeans are from Southeast Asians. This isn't metaphor, it's data. In a groundbreaking study in 2014 by Andres Moreno Estrada and his team, researchers analyzed over 1 million genetic markers. The conclusion was clear. Mexico isn't one genome. It's a network of isolated populations, each shaped by geography, history, and survival. The mountains of Oaxaca protected indigenous villages from Spanish cavalry. The jungles of Chiapas preserved ancient languages and bloodlines untouched by colonization. Meanwhile, in Sonora and Jalisco, the silver mines drew waves of settlers from Europe. Intermarriage began early, and indigenous ancestry slowly receded. Geography wasn't just landscape, it was destiny. Even within cities, the contrast was startling. In Mexico City, researchers found that two neighborhoods separated by a single avenue could show radically different ancestry percentages. 25% European on one side, 70% on the other. Class, migration, and access shaped the genome as much as history did. Your postal code became a genetic echo of your ancestors' fate. But the divide wasn't only regional, it was structural. Centuries of colonization, segregation, and labor patterns carved invisible borders into the DNA of every generation that followed. A miner's lineage in Durango, a farmer's in Chiapas, a fisherman's in Veracruz. Each carried a distinct genetic rhythm, as if the land itself had chosen who they would become. What makes it even more remarkable is that despite all this diversity, Mexico still carries one name. But genetically, it's not a single nation. It's a continent disguised as a country, a living archive of migrations, isolations, and collisions. And yet, beneath these fractures lies an even deeper truth, a truth that hides in the difference between a father's DNA and a mother's DNA. Because the story of Mexico isn't just about where your ancestors lived. It's about who survived to tell the tale.
Every genome tells two stories, one from your father, one from your mother. And in Mexico, those stories couldn't be more different. When scientists first began sequencing Mexican DNA, something strange appeared in the data. Almost every region, from Sonora to Oaxaca, showed European ancestry on the father's side and indigenous ancestry on the mother's. In some places, the pattern was nearly absolute. Y chromosomes, passed only from father to son, were overwhelmingly Spanish, but mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from mothers, remained deeply Native American. It was biology exposing history, quietly, brutally. During the early colonial centuries, Spanish men arrived by the thousands, priests, soldiers, settlers. But there were few European women. Entire generations of mixed-race children were born from indigenous mothers, women who carried not just children, but the trauma and resilience of their erased civilizations. And even as the centuries passed, those maternal lineages survived almost untouched. While languages and names changed, the blood remembered. Today, when geneticists map these patterns, they can literally see the architecture of conquest inside DNA. It's not metaphor, it's measurable. The Y chromosome carries markers from Iberian ancestors, R1b, common in Spain and Portugal. The mitochondrial lineages carry indigenous signatures, A2, B2, C1, D1.
the same haplogroups found in the Americas long before Columbus. In some coastal regions like Veracruz, another thread emerges: African maternal DNA, a legacy of enslaved women who arrived chained but whose descendants walked free centuries later. Every cell becomes a confession of violence, of assimilation, of endurance. And yet, there's a strange kind of poetry in it. Because while men's histories were written in ink, conquests, laws, empires, women's histories were written in blood. They are the unbroken line that never vanished, the genetic spine of a nation that refused to die. Today, when someone in Mexico spits into a DNA tube, they're not just testing ancestry, they're unearthing a map of survival. A map that shows how, against the tides of colonization and time, mothers preserved what empires tried to erase. The science is clear. Mexico's genome is built on an imbalance: European fathers, indigenous and African mothers. But that imbalance tells the truest story of all, that the roots of the nation are feminine, ancient, and unyielding.
Every strand of DNA is a story, and together, those stories form something bigger than blood. They form a people. Mexico's genome isn't clean or simple. It's tangled, contradictory, alive. It carries the silence of indigenous mothers, the ambition of Spanish fathers, the rhythm of Africa, and the whispers of Asia carried by ocean winds. It's not a single identity. It's a symphony of survival. For centuries, the idea of being Mexican was painted as a blend, a mix. But maybe that word, mix, is too small. Because the genome doesn't show blending, it shows layering. Waves of humanity stacked through time, each one leaving traces, each one reshaping the next. In the north, the genes remember Spain. In the south, they remember the first Americans. In the ports, they remember Africa and the Pacific. And in the cities, they remember all of them, meeting, clashing, rebuilding. When you look at Mexico through its genome, you realize something profound. There is no pure blood. There never was. What makes Mexico powerful is not sameness, it's complexity. Because every mutation, every ancestry, every forgotten lineage is proof that humanity endures. So the next time someone says, "This is what a Mexican looks like," remember, there are millions of answers, each one carved by history, each one sacred. And maybe that's what identity really is. Not a label written by history books, but a heartbeat made of everything that came before. If you felt connected to this story, if it made you think about your own blood, your own past, then join us. Subscribe to The Diary of Past, where every week we uncover the hidden stories written in our DNA, the science, the mystery, and the humanity that make us who we are. Because history fades, but the blood remembers.